Hello friends, today I'll be talking about the newest paddle in the ProKennex line, the Pro-Spin. Coming in at $220 retail, the ProKennex website advertises two technologies to enhance spin. Number one, a non-slip applicant put on the surface, and number two, 21 strings submerged beneath the surface to provide texture. Now, if you're wondering if it's even legal to embed strings in a pickleball paddle, it is USA Pickleball approved, and the paddle is indeed legal according to Stare-It testing. Now, Stare-It is that little device that is used to measure surface roughness. So, for this paddle, the peak to valley measurements of the surface have been tested to below 30 micrometers, which is the legal limit. This paddle is ultralight. It comes in at just 7.5 ounces. The length is 15.67 inches, which is slightly longer than some of the other ProKennex paddles due to the fact that it is an elongated paddle surface rather than square, and also it has a slightly longer handle to it. The handle measures 5.3 inches. The width of this paddle is 7.6 inches, and the thickness is a measly 11 millimeters, making this one of the thinnest paddles on the market. It has a honeycomb core with a graphite inlay, and it uses ProKennex's patented kinetic technology, which involves the use of microtungsten beads put in chambers around the perimeter of the paddle, which helps reduce vibrations and also presumably helps reduce things like tennis elbow. So I could tell after playing with this paddle for just a few minutes that it had pretty good spin, but I wanted to quantify it. So I used the same methodology that Chris Olson developed at the Pickleball Studio. A link to his YouTube channel is down below. The methodology basically involves marking a pickleball with a Sharpie to allow the number of rotations to be seen on a camera. Then you record a video of top spin serves, being careful to drop the ball so that the pickleball doesn't have any spin on it whatsoever before you hit it, so that all spin is imparted by the paddle. I used a GoPro camera set at 60 frames per second and then recorded a minimum of 10 serves with each paddle and then averaged the results. Then I'd watch the videos to find a spot where the stripe on the ball was level after being hit. Then you can count the number of video frames it takes for the ball to complete one revolution. Then you do the math in an Excel table to calculate the RPM. To compare the ProKennex Pro-Spin paddle to other paddles, I also spin tested 12 other paddles. Using an average of 10 balls hit, the ProKennex Pro-Spin paddle came in at 1,477 RPM. That puts the paddle right in the middle of all the paddles that I tested. So there were 6 paddles that tested higher and 6 that tested lower. My highest spin paddle was the Carbon One 13 millimeter, which is the one banned by USA Pickleball earlier this year for having too much grit. That one produced a whopping 1,943 RPM. My lowest spin paddle was the Monarch Mercenary, which is an entry-level beginner's paddle. It came in at just above 1,000 RPM. So it was interesting to me that of all the paddles that I tested, my results were pretty close to Chris's at the Pickleball Studio. My results were usually within 100 to 200 RPM of Chris's results, which to me indicates that this is a pretty good way to objectively measure paddle spin. So using the paddle spin categories defined at the Pickleball Studio, who have tested way more paddles than I have, the ProKennex Pro-Spin falls right in between the average spin paddles and the high spin paddles. And these categories are based on average RPM. So low spin paddles would come in below 1,200 RPM. Average spin would be between 1,200 and 1,400 RPM. And high spin are defined as having greater than 1,500 RPM. So one thing I noticed when looking at the data of the Pro-Spin paddle is that there was a lot of variability between RPM of the lowest ball spin and the highest ball spin. So the lowest spin I got on the paddle was just above 1,200 RPM, and the highest spin was just above 1,700 RPM. So there was a 500 RPM range in there, which surprised me. But then I looked at the other paddles, and it was actually fairly typical to get this large range of around 500-600 RPM for some of the paddles that gave the low spin and the average spin. So the lower spin paddles and the average spin paddles had this bigger variability. In contrast, the higher tier of spin paddles, those above 1,500, typically had a low variability in terms of the RPM between hits, typically on the order of 200 to 300 RPM range in that variability. Honestly, I'm a bit surprised that the spin on this ProKennex Pro-Spin paddle wasn't higher, especially when you consider that one of their earlier paddles, which wasn't even advertised as a spin paddle, called the ProFlight, was tested by the Pickleball studio, and they got just above a 1600 RPM spin on this paddle, which was surprising to Chris at the Pickleball studio. And his explanation was that possibly it was a result of it being such a thin paddle, which produces a very low swing weight. And as a result of this low swing weight rate, you can get the ability to whip the paddle up quickly to impart that spin. I played with the ProKennex Pro-Spin for about a week, which is not long enough to give an adequate review, but I can tell you that it's a quality paddle and many people will like it. One thing I noticed about it is that the paddle is balanced well for my tastes. The fulcrum is closer to the handle in contrast to the paddle I play with most of the time, which is a Yola Ben Johns Hyperion. That one's too top heavy for my liking, and I had to put lead tape on the neck of it to get that fulcrum to come down. But the fulcrum of the ProKennex Pro-Spin paddle is already low, and it is ultra lightweight and ultra thin. And as a result of all those things, it has one of the lowest swing weights I've ever played with. One thing I noticed while playing at the kitchen and getting into hand battles is that my hands were much quicker using the Pro-Spin than they are with my heavier Yola paddle. One of the drawbacks of the lightness of this paddle is less power. I noticed that overhead putaways and hard drives were just simply not producing the same velocity as my heavier paddle. But to be fair, I did notice that this paddle was fairly poppy, particularly at the kitchen with things like punches and speed-ups. Another kind of downside or drawback that I experienced with this paddle was less touch. I did tend to get many more pop-ups at the kitchen than I was used to, and you have to use very soft hands to get consistent drops and dinks. Another issue that I had was with resetting, and all of these things can be explained by the very thin paddle profile and the light weight of this paddle. However, for those for those players who do play currently with a lightweight, thin paddle, this one could be a good choice for you. So I don't have data on this, but I suspect that the spin on the ProKennex Pro-Spin paddle will last a good amount of time and won't degrade very quickly. The reason I suspect this is because the strings that provide the texture are buried and submerged beneath the surface, so those strings aren't going to go anywhere. And some of the other paddles do apply kind of this superficial grit, and that tends to wear down fairly quickly. Most notably the Franklin Ben Johns paddle before he went to Yola. That has a reputation for the grit wearing down after just a few days, sometimes even a few hours. I had a similar experience with the Yola Hyperion CAS, which is carbon abrasion surface. It's the same shape as a CFS, same thickness, but they instead of using the carbon fiber, they apply a grit to the surface. Fresh out of the box, that paddle spins great. I was able to shape balls in, hard balls, hard drives would land in. After a couple of weeks, most of that grit had gone away, and those same drives were now flying 2-3 feet out. So the grit tends to wear down fairly quickly on the CAS in my experience. So in contrast, the carbon fiber surfaces tend to have a reputation of lasting longer, providing spin longer. And in general, I think that's true, but I have had an experience with my Yola Hyperion CFS, the carbon fiber surface, that 3 months after I bought it, the spin is noticeably less than the newer version of the paddle. And in fact, when I tested my 3-month-old Hyperion CFS, the results were not overwhelming. They were just over 1,300 RPM, and that is a lot less than the newer paddles that were tested, both by Chris at the Pickleball studio, and one of my friends lent me one of his new Hyperion CFSs, and my spin test on that came in above 1,700 RPM. So even though it wasn't the same paddle, I suspect there is quite a bit of drop-off in terms of spin due to wear on the surface of the paddle. I'm not sure if that's the same for all carbon fiber surface paddles or if the attrition rate is different for different paddles, but that's something that I'll explore a little more in my next video. So please do like and subscribe so you can see the next video.